Some men die in battle. And then there are men who die in ways so violent, so stubborn, and so unbelievable that history never lets them go. A warrior monk who died standing on a bridge. An admiral who won the final battle of a war, then died before his own men were even told. And a battlefield dentist who turned a machine gun into a wall of death. These are not just stories about dying. They are stories about what happens when a man knows the end is coming and decides that fear will not be the last thing controlling him. Today, we are looking at 3 of the most epic last stands in history. And trust me, the first story is already hard to believe, but the second may be even more unbelievable. Because it is about a commander who was betrayed by his own side, came back with almost nothing left, and still helped save his country. And the third? The third is one of the most savage final stands of the Second World War. So let's begin in medieval Japan with a giant warrior monk walking through Kyoto at night, hunting samurai.
By the time Benkei was roaming the streets of Kyoto, he barely looked like a monk at all. He looked like a threat. He was enormous, tall, broad, intimidating, heavily armed. Even in an age filled with warriors, Benkei stood out. And he was not wandering the city in search of peace or enlightenment. He was hunting. Benkei had developed a violent obsession. He challenged samurai to duels. He beat them. Then he took their swords, again and again. It was not just a habit anymore. It had become a collection, a grim one. By that night, he had already taken 999 swords from defeated opponents. He needed only one more. Then he saw the man with the flute. That detail matters, because nothing about the scene looked threatening at first. The samurai was smaller than Benkei, calm, quiet, almost unimpressive. But at his side hung a beautiful sword, exactly the kind of blade Benkei would want as the final prize. So he did what he always did. He challenged him. The samurai accepted. The 2 men went to Gojo Bridge, and Benkei entered the fight expecting the same result he had seen so many times before. A short fight, a beaten enemy, one more sword. Instead, Benkei lost. Not barely, not by luck. He was beaten cleanly.
For a man like Benkei, that was humiliating enough. But then he made it worse for himself. He challenged the samurai again, and lost again. That man was Minamoto no Yoshitsune, one of the most brilliant warriors of his age. And from that moment on, something strange happened. The giant monk who had hunted samurai became the follower of the samurai who had defeated him. Benkei gave up that path and entered Yoshitsune's service. That alone would have made for an unusual story, but the reason people still remember Benkei centuries later is not because he lost 2 duels. It is because of how he died. Years passed, and Yoshitsune's life changed. Power shifted, politics turned. Men who had once benefited from him now feared him. He became a hunted man. Eventually, Yoshitsune and Benkei were cornered, trapped, outnumbered, with no real escape left. This was the end. Yoshitsune understood that. Benkei understood it too. And in that age, a man like Yoshitsune would rather die by his own hand than be captured and humiliated. But there was one problem. He needed time. Not much, just enough time to prepare for death on his own terms. And that meant someone had to stand between him and the men coming to kill him. Benkei never hesitated. He walked to the bridge.
That bridge was the only entrance, a narrow path, a perfect place for one man to delay many. So Benkei stood there alone and waited. Then the attackers came. The first wave rushed forward. Benkei cut them down. More came. More died. Again and again, the attackers surged toward him, and again, he drove them back. Think about what that means. An army had the numbers, but on that bridge, numbers did not arrive all at once. They arrived in pieces. And every man who stepped forward had to become the next man to test Benkei up close. Soon, fear itself became one of Benkei's weapons. The attackers began to hesitate because the problem was no longer just killing him. The problem was deciding who would go first. So the attackers changed tactics.
If they could not get past him in close combat, they would kill him from a distance. Archers were called in. Arrows struck him. One, then another, then many more. Still, he did not fall. His body began to fill with arrows, but from a distance, he still looked as if he were standing firm, still ready to kill whoever came next. Finally, some of the attackers forced themselves forward, and only when they reached him did they realize the truth. Benkei was already dead. He had died on his feet, dead, but still blocking the bridge. And behind him, Yoshitsune had been given the time he needed. And as incredible as that story is, the next one may be even more extraordinary, because now we leave medieval Japan behind and move to Korea.
If you want to see how dangerous corruption can be, look at a country right before an invasion. That was Korea in the late 1500s. Its politics were rotten. Its leadership was divided. Its military system was weaker than it should have been. Too many officials had power. Too few had competence. And then Japan invaded. At that time, Japan had just emerged from a long period of internal warfare. That meant something dangerous. Large numbers of battle-hardened Japanese veterans were no longer busy fighting one another. Now they were free to fight someone else. In 1592, they turned toward Korea. And the opening phase of the invasion was a disaster. Japanese forces advanced fast. Korean defenses collapsed. Cities fell. Fear spread everywhere. At sea, things were not much better. Some Korean naval commanders were so poor and so frightened that they destroyed their own ships rather than risk fighting the enemy. That should have been the beginning of total collapse. Instead, Korea still had one man. His name was Yi Sun-sin. Yi was not the kind of officer corrupt people enjoy having around. He was disciplined, capable, uncompromising. And in a broken system, a competent man can be more threatening to insiders than the enemy outside, because every success he has makes everyone around him look smaller.
Yi's career was shaped not only by war, but by envy. He was slandered, demoted, imprisoned, tortured, more than once by his own side. Think about how insane that is. Your country is being invaded, and yet some of the most powerful people in it are still more focused on destroying their rival than saving the nation. But whenever Yi was allowed to command, the result became hard to ignore. Because on land, the Japanese were terrifying. At sea, under Yi, they became vulnerable. The Japanese preferred closing in, boarding enemy ships, and turning sea battles into brutal close combat. Yi refused to give them that kind of fight. Instead, he used heavier ships, cannon fire, formation discipline, and positioning to destroy them at range. He turned the sea into a trap. Again and again, Japanese ships advanced with confidence and were smashed apart. In only weeks, Yi was winning major victories and destroying enemy ships in huge numbers without losing his own. At a moment when Korea desperately needed hope, Yi gave them more than hope. He gave them results, real victories. And that should have made him untouchable. It didn't, because jealousy rarely behaves rationally.
Court enemies kept whispering against him. Lies spread. And when the war reignited, Yi was accused again, stripped of command again, thrown into prison again, and tortured again. Then the man who replaced him took charge, and the result was catastrophe. Without Yi, the Korean Navy suffered a terrible defeat. A fleet that had once resisted the Japanese was practically shattered. By the time the authorities understood the scale of their mistake, almost nothing was left. So Yi was brought back. But he was not brought back to a glorious command. He was brought back to ruins. Only 13 ships remained. A few hundred exhausted, demoralized men. That was it. By any normal military standard, he should have been finished. He wasn't. This is the point where Yi Sun-sin stopped being merely impressive and became something close to unbelievable. With that tiny force, he faced a much larger Japanese fleet. And instead of being destroyed, he broke them. Using geography, timing, and discipline, he tore apart an enemy force that should have overwhelmed him.
He destroyed dozens of Japanese ships while losing none of his own. That bought Korea time. Time to rebuild. Time to breathe. Time to survive.
Then history shifted. Hideyoshi died. Japan ordered its forces to withdraw from Korea. But Yi understood something very simple. A retreating enemy can still return later. If you want the war to end properly, you hit them hard on the way out. So in the final phase of the war, Yi joined the effort to strike the withdrawing Japanese fleet. That led to the last great battle. This was it. Years of war, years of invasion, years of humiliation, resistance, and survival. And now, finally, a chance to close it. Yi stood aboard his flagship. War drums thundered, ships clashed, smoke filled the air, wood splintered, cannon fire roared, and through all of it, Yi remained at the front. Victory was finally coming into view. Then, he was shot. A musket ball struck him under the arm. It was a fatal wound. And in that moment, Yi Sun-sin gave the order that made his death unforgettable. Do not announce my death. So his body was carried below deck. The drums kept beating. The fleet kept advancing. Korea won. And Yi Sun-sin died listening to the sounds of victory he had helped create. And if that story feels brutal, the last one is even closer, uglier, and more personal. Because now we move to World War II.
One of the most savage last stands in modern military history was made by a man who, on paper, was not supposed to be there. He was not some famous assault commander, not some mythic commando. He was a dentist. His name was Ben L. Salomon. Salomon had joined the U.S. Army after dental school and served as a dental officer. He was well-trained, capable, and respected. But nothing about that role suggests the kind of ending his story would have. In 1944, American forces were fighting on Saipan, one of the bloodiest island battles of the Pacific War. Casualties were appalling. The fighting was close, brutal, and relentless. And by July, the battlefield had become chaos. Salomon was working with the wounded. That was where he was supposed to be, an aid station, in the rear, trying to save damaged bodies while the fighting raged elsewhere. Then the line broke. Japanese troops surged through in a massive assault. Suddenly, the battle was no longer somewhere off in the distance. It was right there, close enough to hear clearly, close enough to see men dying almost at the tent itself.
Salomon stepped outside and saw a Japanese soldier bayoneting a wounded American. That was the moment everything changed. He grabbed a rifle and shot the attacker. Then more enemy soldiers came. He shot them too. Others pushed into the area. Salomon fought them at close range. Gunfire, desperate blows, violence at arm's length. The aid station was no longer a place of treatment. It had become a battlefield. And then Salomon understood what was really happening. This was not a temporary breach. This was collapse. If the wounded remained where they were, many of them would die. If nobody held the attackers back, the entire station would be overrun. So Salomon made a decision. He ordered the evacuation of the wounded, and he stayed behind. That choice is what separates this from an ordinary combat death. Because it is one thing to fight when you are trapped. It is another thing entirely to decide that you will be the one left behind so others can get out. As the attack worsened, Salomon saw the crew of a machine gun position go down. So he moved to the gun, and once he got there, he opened fire on the advancing Japanese troops.
Picture that scene. The wounded are being pulled away. Enemy troops are surging forward. The line is collapsing. And one man who was never meant to be the primary defender of that position plants himself behind a machine gun and refuses to leave. He kept firing, burst after burst, again and again, even as the enemy closed in, even as the position was being swallowed, even as his own body was being torn apart. The enemy kept coming, and Salomon kept firing. When American troops later returned to the area, they found him dead at the machine gun position. In front of him were huge numbers of dead Japanese soldiers. His own body had been shredded by bullets, bayonet wounds, and close combat trauma, showing just how long and how violently he had kept fighting. He had not simply died in the wrong place. He had deliberately turned himself into a barrier, a wall, a final shield for the wounded behind him. 3 men, 3 wars, 3 final stands that should have ended in silence, but didn't. Different countries, different centuries, same idea. When the end finally came, they did not run. This video is a dramatic retelling based on historical accounts for storytelling and educational purposes. And if you want more true stories this brutal, tragic, and unforgettable, stay with me for the next one.